Hi, I'm Tony from freshcapmushrooms.com, and I'm here looking at a pasteurized straw log that I made just over 2 weeks ago, and it's just about ready to be put into fruiting conditions. Now this log was made with pasteurized straw and blue oyster grain spawn at a spawn ratio of about 10%. The mycelium's really worked its way through the log. It's not completely consolidated, meaning that there is still some straw that has not yet been overtaken by the mycelium. But if you take a closer look at the perforations we put in the bag, you can see that there's little knots starting to form, which is the first step towards pinning, which eventually leads to mushrooms. So typically what you'd want to do to fruit this log would be to lower the temperature a little bit and increase the humidity. This would further initiate more pinning and eventually cause full mushrooms to form. But in my part of the world right now, it's springtime, the conditions are kind of cool, and they're just about right for fruiting mushrooms outside. Oyster mushrooms, especially blue oyster mushrooms, require a ton of fresh air to form properly. If they don't get enough fresh air, they grow really long stems and tiny little caps, and they end up being not all that good to eat. But if they have enough fresh air, they end up forming really large caps and large clusters, which is the part of the mushrooms that you want to eat. So fruiting them outside is an easy way to do it. It's an awesome way to do it, and it provides great results, but you just got to pick them at the right time, and you got to get them before the bugs get to them. So we're going to go ahead and take this log outside. So I got the log hanging back here in a tree. As you can see, the conditions aren't 100% ideal. Obviously there is some direct sunlight on it, but it is late in the day, so there's not a lot of heat involved. But like I was saying, the one thing you got to worry about when growing mushrooms outside, obviously, and you can see them everywhere here, are the bugs. Pretty much as soon as your mushrooms start to form, bugs will burrow little holes inside your mushrooms and they'll lay eggs, and you'll open your mushroom up and it'll be all rotten or buggy on the inside. So we're going to be watching this log pretty closely over the next couple days, and we're going to be seeing how the pins are starting to form at all those perforations, and we're going to see what we get. So it's been a few days now, and if you look at the oyster log, it's starting to form these really heavy pin clusters. The pins and the clusters are forming more readily underneath the plastic. But where we actually cut the perforations, where we want the mushrooms to grow out, the pins are kind of dying back or aborting. And I think this is because where I have the log hanging right now, although it's in the shade and out of the sun, it's been pretty windy these last few days. And I think it's just drying out the pins really quick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this log off this tree where I have it hanging and kind of put it closer to the ground and a little bit out of the wind. I'm also going to go ahead and soak down the area around the log, and this will just kind of help keep the humidity up around the log. So hopefully some of these large clusters of pins will actually start to fruit out of the holes in the bag. There's some locations like right here where there's actually no perforation in the bag whatsoever, yet there's a nice little cluster forming underneath the bag. So I'm going to go ahead and slice the poly back a little bit, giving the cluster here a chance to fully fruit. Now the reason this method is so effective is because the straw log kind of mimics the way oyster mushrooms might grow in nature. The inside of the straw is like the inside of the tree, where the poly tubing on the outside is kind of like the bark. And the mushrooms will try and find a hole in the bark or a hole in the poly tubing to actually fruit from, while the inside of the tree is colonized. Look at this oyster log. It's been probably about a week now since these things have been fruiting outside, and they're just about ready for harvest. You can tell oyster mushrooms are ready for harvest when the cap starts to tip up. That means it's getting ready to kind of release its spores, and once it does that, then the mushroom spoils pretty quickly. So you want to pay attention to it and watch it really closely, and we're almost there with this particular log, especially with some of the clusters. This will happen quite often where not the whole log's going to flush all at the same time. When you say first flush and second flush and third flush, it doesn't necessarily mean the mushroom's going to grow all its mushrooms at once, be done, then grow all its mushrooms again and be done. It's kind of more of a revolving process, and it's just the first time you harvest it, you're going to call that the first flush, even though some mushrooms might be more ready than others. Some might still have more room to grow than others. So I think I'm going to go ahead and harvest this big one on top, and probably harvest this cluster down here But the other two I'm probably going to leave for another day or so. What you do is just take a real sharp knife, just kind of cut the mushroom off right at the stem. It's better to cut off the whole cluster than to try and pick off individual mushrooms, because they're a little bit delicate, and if you try and pick off individual ones, then you might end up breaking them, but that's pretty much all there is to it. So this cluster here has probably still got a little ways to go. I'm probably going to let that sit for at least overnight, maybe another day or so. Same thing with this guy over here. You can see that the caps are still kind of folded over, quite small, and there's still quite a ways to grow for those ones. The best part of the oyster mushroom by far is the cap. You don't want to get too much stem, because the stem is actually pretty chewy and pretty tough and not all that great. For example, this big cluster is pretty much all cap. If you look at the back of it even, the stems are really quite small, so really don't have too much to worry about there at all. This cluster, the one that was growing inside the bag, you can see there's quite a bit of stem on the back here, and you might want to cut that off. So weighing this cluster out is about ½ a pound, and you can see that, you know, it might be a nice little package that you could sell at a farmer's market or something if you had, say, a lot of straw logs going at the same time. But in the area that I live, fresh oyster mushrooms like this get about $10 a pound. So this would be about $5 worth of oyster mushrooms just in this one little container. And what you get here is fresh, beautiful oyster mushrooms. Now, a lot of people won't be selling these. You're just going to be putting them in the fridge or using them right away. And if you put them in the fridge, they're going to stay good for a number of days, but they're not going to stay good for weeks or anything like that. But that is the benefit of growing mushrooms at home. There's a really good chance that you're not going to find oyster mushrooms like this at your grocery store. And the reason for that is, number one, they don't transport all that well. So if you don't have a local grower in your area, you're unlikely to get fresh oyster mushrooms brought in from anywhere else. And also, they don't last all that long, and they're relatively quick to spoil. So they're not going to be able to sit on the grocery store shelves for all that long. That being said, they also don't last all that long in your fridge. You might get a nice couple of days out of them, maybe a week, but you're going to want to use them relatively quickly. They're best if you use them right after you pick them. So you pick them and you fry them up right away. So I waited about another day and a half before going ahead and harvesting the rest of the log, and I'm kind of glad I did. If we take a look at them. And this one over here is pretty huge, and this is just about the exact stage where you want to pick them. The oysters have grown about as big as they're going to get. The only thing they're going to do now is start to curl up the cap of the mushroom to get ready to drop the spores. But right now it's pretty much the perfect time to harvest them. And look at that nice cluster we got. So overall we got just over 1.5 pounds from this last harvest here, putting the grand total of the log right now at about 3 pounds on the first flush. So that's it for this video. We're going to go ahead and cook these mushrooms up. In the meantime, we're just going to leave that log out there and see if we can get some subsequent flushes out of there. We should be able to get at least 2 or 3 more flushes of mushrooms. And when it does finally stop producing mushrooms altogether, it makes a really good compost that you can add to your garden or put in your compost pile. But that's all subject for another video. So until next time, thanks for watching. I'm Tony from freshcapmushrooms.com, and we'll see you again.